and some of that information included knowledge about astronomy. Although it only turned out to be a handful of words that we know, many of his journals were lost. So we don't know how much he was really told, but you know, the 200 and some odd years since then, in the 1840s, a gentleman, an Englishman named William Stanbridge, recorded indigenous knowledge from the Boron clan, the Wagaya language group in western Victoria. And that stands today as one of the earliest sort of comprehensive accounts we have of indigenous astronomy in Australia. There isn't a whole lot of research being done on a grand scale in Australia, but there are a handful of us who are doing quite a bit of work. What I want to do is talk to you a little bit about some of the preliminary research that we're doing, that I'm doing really, in the Torres Strait. So how many people here have been to Australia before? A few of you, okay. So Australia is quite a large place, a lot of diversity there. The Aboriginal people there have been in Australia for at least 50,000 years. Relatively isolated, not a whole lot of contact with the outside world until a few hundred years ago with the Macassan Indonesian fishermen who had come to trade sea cucumbers, essentially. So it's an area where you have a lot of diversity in geographic region, although about 2/3 of the continent is in fact desert. But you have over 400 distinct language groups, and each one has an individual language and culture, and within those anywhere from 1 to a dozen different dialects. You have tremendous diversity of indigenous groups in Australia that stretch back well over 50,000 years. Some estimates place it maybe as high as 60 or 70,000 years, but a long time regardless. The first postgraduate thesis ever published or ever completed on indigenous astronomy, I thought, mistakenly, that I had done it in 2011, but actually turns out there was a guy in 1911 who did one at Leipzig University. So I'm very happy to be able to go there later this year to see what he had done. I will be presenting a poster tomorrow, I forgot to bring it in today, from some colleagues of mine at Macquarie University, Ray Norris and Bob Fuller, who've been working on looking at indigenous astronomy from north-central New South Wales with elders Gamilaroi and Uwalyi in the Sun Degree Morawari area in that region. They've been doing a lot of what we've been talking about the last couple of days. They're working with the indigenous communities. The project was instigated by invitation, not us knocking on people's doors and saying, "Can we tell you stuff?" It was more of us doing an outreach campaign, getting people excited, getting people interested, and now communities are coming to us, which is the proper way to do it. Went on board with the Board of Elders, and the elders are now co-authors on the publications that we're putting out. And some of that is just starting to gain a little bit of media in Australia. Indigenous astronomy has exploded in Australia over the last 5 or 6 years. It went from once every few years you might see an article or media piece about it, to now there's probably at least half a dozen every year. Every time we publish a paper, it gets media attention, which is really saying something. The public are really absorbing this. They're really fascinated by it. And in a country where indigenous culture and indigenous knowledge have traditionally been seen quite negatively, and a lot of it tends to focus less on the positive aspects, but more on the fact that Aboriginal people in Australia have a 19-year gap in life expectancy, the poverty, the effects of colonization. By focusing on astronomy, it's a great opportunity to get people not only interested, but to see the positive benefits and the positive aspects of indigenous knowledge in Australia. And it's really taking off. I talked a bit on Saturday about some of the education, the teaching, the outreach programs, the City Observatory, and whatnot that we're doing. But what I'm going to focus on today is a project that we're just now getting our teeth sunk into. So at the end of last year, I won a discovery grant from the Australian Research Council to study cultural astronomy in the Torres Strait. And there were a couple of reasons I went about doing that. When I took on my academic job at the University of New South Wales, the director there, Professor Martin Nakata, is a Torres Strait Islander. He's also the first one to get a PhD in Australia, and he's considered one of the top indigenous educators in the country. He was very interested in this. I was very interested in this. He brought me in to work on indigenous astronomy and sort of left me to my own devices, like whatever I wanted to do. And I said, look, I'm very interested in Torres Strait Islander astronomy. From what I've read, it seems to be heavily ingrained in their culture. He was excited, of course, being an islander from the islands, not not an islander from Sydney or Melbourne, but being from the islands, growing up there, he was very happy about that. So we put in for the grant, we won it, and we've finally been able to get on country. Just a couple of weeks ago, we went to Murray Island. So to go on, so we've got Australia here, Papua New Guinea above us. The Torres Strait is that little. Do we have a laser pointer? No, don't worry about it. Now, a little group of islands between the tip of Cape York Peninsula and Papua New Guinea, which we'll kind of zoom into now, divided into 5 major island groups, each of the different geological formation. In general, they're divided between the Western Islands, which consists of the Northern, the Western, and the Southwestern Islands, and the Central Islands. The Eastern Islands are a bit distinct. There are 2 major languages in the Torres Strait. Meriamir, which is the Eastern languages, the Eastern Islands. That's more closely related to the Papuan languages, whereas the others are Kaloyagala and Kalawagala, slightly different dialects of that language. Those are more closely related to the Australian Aboriginal languages. One of the things to remember about the Torres Strait is during the last ice age, prior to about 8,000 years ago, that was a land bridge between New Guinea and Cape York Peninsula. It was also a land bridge that connected Tasmania with the mainland Australia. Giant landmass we called Sahul. So the islands are actually fairly recent in the grand scheme of things when you look at Australia as a whole. Much of what we know about early islander culture come from the ethnographic records of the Haddon expedition in the late 19th century, and that focused predominantly on the Mare Island group, Murray Island, Duane, and Ware, down at the bottom too. Murray Island has a population of a few hundred people, and I think maybe 2 or 3 people living on the other 2 islands, but not many. These are the very tip of the Great Barrier Reef, they're volcanic islands, and unlike the Western Islands where it tends to be very shallow seas, these are very deep seas. This drops off to a few hundred meters just outside of the reef there. So the cultures are old, but the people are ancestors of much older people. So it's kind of interesting to see how, during the course of the research, how old some of these traditions are and how they vary across the islands. Now, to give you some context about Torres Strait Islander culture, the best thing to do is to go to their flag. The green on the flag represents the islands, the land. The blue represents the ocean. They were a seafaring people. The black bars represent the people who live between the sea and the land. The strange-looking arc shape in the middle, that white thing, is called a geri, ceremonial headdress. It was actually worn by the warriors. Now it's used more in ceremony. And the star represents 2 things. The 5 points represent the 5 major island groups of the Torres Strait, and the star itself represents a navigational star. The color white, a symbol of peace, represents what they refer to as the coming of the light, or the coming of the Christian missionaries, which very much altered a lot of the islander culture. But they still maintain very strong traditional pre-colonial ways. The book Stars of Tagai was actually written by Nani Sharp in 1993. This is sort of a treatise on islander culture. It gives you an idea about the importance of astronomy and stars within islander culture. Now, the book itself is about the islander people. It's not focused on astronomy itself. But it uses the story of Tagai, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and describes how that's a centerpiece of islander culture. When I was looking at what project I wanted to write a grant for in Australia, I was very drawn to the islands because it seemed that the culture was entirely based on astronomy. It wasn't a component, it was completely engrossed in astronomy itself. When I saw the book, The Stars of Tagai, I thought, damn, that's the best title for a book on islander astronomy. But it actually doesn't talk much about anything relating to do with planets, the Milky Way, the Magellanic Clouds, the sun, the moon. It gives some information about calendars and how they relate to Tagai, but that's really about it. Turns out the first and last treatise written on Torres Strait Islander astronomy was published in 1907 by Rivers, who was one of the people on the Haddon expedition from Cambridge. So there's quite a bit that hasn't been recorded. On Thursday Island, which is probably the most populous island in the Torres Strait, there's the Gab Tutui Cultural Center. Just a few weeks ago, actually 2 weeks ago, Martin Atkinson and myself went up to Murray Island to meet with the elders. And we did it in the way of, well, to give you an example, there were two academics. One, I believe, was American, who came down, and the other one was from the Australian National, not the Australian National University, the National Museum in Canberra. And they were quite excited to come in, meet with the elders, sit down, film them talking about stuff, get this, go off, make documentaries, whiz, bang, boom. Our approach was very different. We didn't go there to do research. We went there just to meet people, to get to know people. We didn't go in and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. We simply went in. I basically shadowed Martin. I had a bit of a dumb look in my face the whole time, because that really works well when you're sort of a foreigner and an academic coming in to those communities. Didn't say much, just got to know people. And after a few days, we met with the Council of Elders, who had invited us to come out. Martin did most of the talking and sort of sussed us out a bit. Was asked if I was an anthropologist, and I said, no, I'm an astronomer. They said, good. Anthropologist, anthropology in many indigenous communities is still very much a bad term because of a lot of historical wrongs that have been done in the name of anthropology. Things you've been describing before over the last few days were done in Australia. And it's one of these situations where in Australia, much like you guys were talking about before, if we want to go work with an Aboriginal community, we have to have the community on board. We can't just go knocking on people's doors. We go through a very rigorous and stringent ethics process where there has to be a giving back component. There has to be a mutual benefit. If there's no benefit for the community, it will not be approved, period. So some of the giving back we do, I'll talk about a bit later. Anyway, we went to this center, coming back from Murray Island. We wanted to see if they had any artifacts or anything related to astronomy. We went inside and found out that Gagtatui means journey of the stars, and that about 70% of their collection was astronomy. It really just blew us away. In fact, in Torres Strait Islander culture, they have a special name for the people, the men, most of it's always the men in that culture, who were the astronomers. They were the primary knowledge holders. Zugabu Mamyag is actually from the Kali Yagala language. This is very modern art pieces. The title of my talk originally, which is in the abstracts, was Ancient Yet Modern. I did this to emphasize that even though these are ancient people who've been there for thousands of years, their culture is still strong. They haven't been relegated to the distant past. They continue the traditions now, and everybody has this knowledge. So to understand Torres Strait Islander people, you have to understand the story of Tagai. The story of Tagai was that he was a great warrior and expert fisherman. He went on a fishing expedition with 12 crew, they called Zugables, 12 men, and as they went out on the reef, they went fishing, didn't have any luck, so Tagai decided to go out on the reef to find a place where they could maybe get some better fishing. They had their water kept in these containers on the boat. Well, the Zugables drank all their water, and during the day, as time progressed, they decided to drink Tagai's water as well, breaking a sacred taboo. When Tagai came back, he was very upset and decided to kill all 12 of the Zugables. There are variations of the story, and some he tied the men up into two groups of 6 and tossed them into the ocean where they drowned, and then one into the sky. One group, the Usium, became the stars of the Pleiades. Another group, Utimal, became the stars that we see in the belt and scabbard of Orion, or as they call in Australia, that asterism they refer to as the saucepan, because it looks like a saucepan. And he himself went up into the opposite side of the sky. He is an enormous constellation. You can see here, this is the Southern Cross. This is left hand holding a spear. His right hand is Corvus the Crow, holding sort of a red flowery fruit, an apple. His body goes all the way down. He's standing on top of his canoe, which is traced out by the stars in Scorpius. Now, this might sound familiar to those in here, probably everybody who are familiar with the story of Orion and Scorpius. He went to the opposite side of the sky to get away from the Zugables, so it's reminiscent of Orion, the Scorpion, being put on opposite sides of the sky as well. The story of Tagai is important for the Islander people. It denotes them as being seafaring people who share a common way of life. The stars of Tagai are the custodians of the knowledge and spirituality for the current islanders and future generations. It gives them an order of the world. So it encompasses all of their laws and their customs, their old traditions. They're all instructed by Tagai. Now what I've given you obviously is the kindergarten, preschool version of the Tagai story. It's much deeper than that. And the cycle of life is a period of time and renewal based on the rising and setting of particular stars. Their entire culture is based on astronomy. So that's the story of Tagai, and before I go on to the next one, there are things that inform the people about the stars of Tagai. So when you get the Hamacher rising of the Pleiades, that tells the people that they've got about a month and a half or 2 months before the kuki or the wet season comes, and they need to plant crops. So the different islands had different ways of gathering food. Some were more based on fishing, some had agriculture. The central islands are very small. They focus more on trade with the eastern and the western islands. But there is some causality in how some of the stories were interpreted. So later on, just as the wet season is starting to begin, you see the Pleiades setting at dusk. It's actually believed when the Pleiades hit the water of the ocean, it actually splashes water up to create the monsoon season that's about to arrive. So there's a lot of depth to those stories, and I'll go into more detail at a different time. But what I want to talk about is one other constellation. This is something I got a bit of personal experience with just a couple of weeks ago. In Aboriginal cultures, connected dots constellations are incredibly rare. Usually it's a particular star or an object or cluster of stars that represents a character and story. There are a few examples of connected dots patterns, but for the most part they're pretty rare. Whereas in Torres Strait Islander culture they're quite common. Bidum is a shark. It's a generic term for shark. It doesn't refer to any specific shark, but it's a generic term. That's more of the Marian language, and the other language it's Bezium, very close to the site. This is actually traced out by this lovely constellation, which brings back fond memories of my 28 years growing up in the U.S., which you never see from Sydney, the Big Dipper, part of Ursa Major. You can kind of get an idea of a shark figure there, but actually the tail goes further back, and the snout goes a bit further forward. When the shark, the constellation, because it's to the north, rises in the east, that's in the west, when it's parallel over Papua New Guinea, that's special significance, but just after sunset, when the nose of the shark touches the water, that signifies the shark breeding season has begun. Now, for those of you who don't know, when the sharks are breeding, that's the time you want to stay out of the water. It's very dangerous. And I wanted to show you this little video when I got to Murray Island. Professor Knockton and I went down to the water, and just at sunset, and in ankle-deep water, this is what we saw. This is literally right up on the beach. You see the sharks going left and right. You see up on the left there. They're all over the place. They had hammerheads, they had reef sharks, they were all over the place. I only got a little bit of the video of one of them. Now this water is literally this deep. That's it. So at one point I thought it'd be great to go out and look very refreshing when I jump in the water. No, bad idea. And what I noticed about this was I'd read about Bidum before, and the night before, when we were still on Thursday Island before we flew over to Murray, I looked up and I noticed that it was setting on the horizon. The nose was touching the horizon. And I told Mark, and I said, "Oh, look at that. I think that means the sharks are going to be breeding." When we got up there, we looked down, and that's immediately what we saw. One of the main activities you do when you go to the Torres Strait is you fish. I've been there twice, and I spent about 80% of the time fishing. This second time we went up there, we stopped in Cairns, and we got up early in the morning, and I noticed it was the third quarter moon. And I talked to Mark, and I said, I noticed the third quarter moon. Last time it came up, it was the first quarter moon. He's like, "Oh, you are paying attention." I said, "Oh, why is that?" He's like, "Why do you think?" I'm like, "Well, maybe because the tides will be, the extremes won't be as high." He's like, "Yes, that's what it was. The best time to go fishing." Astronomy and dance and music. I'm going to try not to go over too long, so I'll hurry a bit. But this is a modern dance based on astronomy where they use some of these dance machines I'll talk about in a second. This is a dance and a song about the Southern Cross. notice in their hands the machine opens and closes. Goes on for another couple of minutes. I'd love to watch this, but I know I'm running out of time a bit. They have a lot of dance machines, and they're all mechanical. They denote movement. So on the left there, you see a comet one, and it stretches out in this direction. It shows the comet, which I believe, even though they call it a comet, I think in many cases they're conflating comets with meteors. Well, at least I thought that, and then I noticed that this bottom one here is actually referring to a shooting star. So I thought, okay. So I don't know if they're referring to maybe a ball light, like a big fireball or not, but I noticed in a lot of the indigenous traditions, I don't know if it's from the anthropologists, they conflate those two terms. But these dances are incredibly common, so here's one of the shooting star dance machine being extended. As part of the giving back process, we're looking at different types of tools and things we can develop for the students predominantly. Because when it comes to communities, they want the knowledge back in the books and the articles, of course, but their main focus is future generations. They want to ensure that the kids are learning this stuff. And they're happy for the Western science and the Indigenous science to both be taught. So this is a little video of some stuff they're doing on Badu and Magyag Islands in the Western Islands. Where they have the sky program on iPads.
That's all right on there.
Now these don't have any Torres Strait constellations or information on them yet. They're just getting a chance to hold these devices up and see what the sky looks like.
iPads last night. I've never seen anything like it.
The kids were excited. They love this kind of thing. So one of the tools we're going to be developing is the same thing a lot of you guys are going to be doing in your respective areas, is putting this stuff into stellarium, into the night sky, putting this information in there so that the kids will be able to learn from it. And I want to give one final thing, since I'm almost out of time, but I'm doing pretty good. This is from one of the elders in the Western Islands, John Watt, who gave a talk on islander astronomy at IATSIS in Canberra about 5 years ago. He's leading a project on those Western Islands to focus more on the astronomy. So this is from him.
For Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people to come together, I see this as practical reconciliation, of coming together, of understanding worldviews. We have appreciated over time the Western worldviews and paradigms. In our stories, like in the Kaurek stories, you see them, you can plainly see them, that those stories are from the paradigms, the worldviews of Indigenous people. Let us yarn these stories. They're good for us. I certainly enjoy them. And the important audience were the children.
So a lot of the work that we're focusing on, essentially, is not looking at Indigenous knowledge and Western science as opposite ends of the spectrum, which is what you guys are not doing. You're obviously looking at ways forward. So it's about moving forward. It's about getting students involved in science and Indigenous knowledge and showing that there are two very important, very useful ways of looking at the natural world. So if anybody has a QR code, that takes you to our Indigenous astronomy blog in Strait. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
I have two questions. First, if I'm not mistaken, this region is equatorial, right?
Very close.
It's probably very cloudy. How many times at night can you see stars?
They have a wet season and a dry season. They're very distinct. I was up there for a week and the skies were beautiful. During the dry season, especially, because the air is so dry and there are very few clouds, I mean, you get amazing views. There's very little light pollution out there, especially on places like Murray Island. It's so far removed from the mainland that aside from a few of the lampposts there on the island, you get amazing views.
This means that in their knowledge of the sky, there will be a part of the sky that has never been seen, or very seldomly seen. This is the one that will be always blocked by clouds. Did you find something
I
like
can
this?
address that. So when ethnoastronomy and archaeoastronomy started to get rolling in the 1970s, they looked at arguments like cloud cover and who's going to have more in their culture or less in their culture due to cloud cover. And they found that there wasn't a correlation. When the stars are out, people looked. Right? And cloud cover wasn't always absolute. You have things coming in, you know. So when the stars were out, they looked.
Even in the wet season, when you get heavy rain during the day, the clouds dissipate for a while, you get beautiful evenings, you get beautiful nights, you can see quite a bit. Now, it'd be interesting to see as part of the project how this knowledge is evolved over the last 8,000 years. Because if you go back 8,000 years, precession means that the stars have all changed position. So they're rising or setting at dusk or dawn, and that correlating to changing season or animal breeding cycle would have been something totally different. So we know that these indigenous knowledges related to the stars have a lifespan. They can only be 7,000 or 8,000 years old. Before that, it had to have been something different. So we know they've had to change over time. And that's something that I'm very interested about, because about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago is when the island's formed from the rise of the sea level.
I'm going to try this.
Yeah, give it a go.
Another question. Another question, please, so I can get this code in my laptop and see if it works.
I hope so. So if you get you can download the app. I never bothered to try this until recently, so now whenever we do conference posters, we always have this, because everybody wants the link, but either it's a long drawn out link, you don't want to memorize, you're trying to write it down, you scan it, and boom, there it takes you right to it.
Okay, here we go. Went somewhere. Hey,
Boom.
yes, it worked.
Yes.
Okay, that's awesome. Success! All right. Any other questions? Yes.
There are many astronomical observatory of Australia where anthropologists and astronomers and native people working together.
Yes. So with the SKA, Stephen Keeney leads a project out at Curtin University where they're building the SKA in Australia, where the ASCAP is the sort of the equivalent of Meerkat here. They did a project called Ilgarajiri, which is a Yemeji word meaning things belonging to the stars. They did a big art exhibition where they actually had the astronomers and the Aboriginal elders sit down by a campfire and share stories. And they looked through telescopes and had a bit of a yarn, or a chat as they call it. And at the end of that, they made artworks about their experience. And that went on a tour all the way around the world. It actually came here at one point. So they're doing that, and programs. I also work at Sydney Observatory. I mentioned this a couple of days ago at the workshop. We developed a Dreamtime Astronomy program, because the observatory at Sydney is outreach only. We run tours every day, every night of the year, except Christmas and Easter. So we have night tours that we have all about Indigenous astronomy, run by Indigenous guides, where we have planetarium sessions. We go to the telescopes, and we do make planispheres, have some other interactive technology. So those are building up. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going down to Melbourne to share with them some stuff on local Wurundjeri astronomy, human nation astronomy, so they can help develop programs. So it's really taking off now. But yes, we do that sort of thing.
Thanks so much.